let's bring on the man whose website is on the screen right now. Eric Peters Autos is the website. Go to ericpetersautos.com, and you can follow Eric on Twitter if you go to at Libertarian Car G. That's Libertarian Car G. Eric, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us here on the Conspiracy for Freedom, because, of course, liberty is out of fashion nowadays.
Well, it's my pleasure, Gard. And per your comment about the vacuousness of the left,
yeah,
I wish it were only that. You know, one can address and deal with stupidity. This is different. It's maliciousness.
Oh, sorry. What did you say? Sorry, you just faded out there.
Oh, I was going to say it's not vacuousness, you know, merely a problem of a person being not particularly bright, let's say, not particularly thoughtful. These people aren't dumb; they're malicious, and I think it's very important to draw that distinction.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and they're not. It's interesting as well, Eric, because you can get a sense of just how venal and malicious they are just from their body language. And you know, politics brings that sort of thing out in people so much, but the way that they will just errantly claim people are racist, or I feel threatened by you, was what one woman said yesterday, and you just say to yourself, what are you talking about? And they just don't stop. I hope people are seeing this, but you know, hopefully one or two people every day are starting to have their eyes opened if they haven't already. And maybe they're saying, gee, I'm seeing who's playing fair here and who is not. And again, you know, I'm a libertarian. I'm an anarchist. I don't even support government by the political means in any way. But I think we can clearly see who's trying to play fair, at least in those hearings there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a real stumbling block for most people, in that most people assume when they're dealing with somebody else that the other person is well meant and that it's just a misunderstanding. And, you know, if we can just communicate with one another, we can figure out what the problem is and move forward and solve it.
Yeah.
That's not what we're dealing with here. And it's very, very hard to get that at a gut core level and to understand that. You know, Fauci, whether it's Fauci, whether it's Biden, anybody, any of these people, they are fundamentally not just dishonest, they are mendacious, and they're corrupt. And whatever they pretend to hold forth and espouse as a principle is merely situational. A really good example of this is the way the left did a parking brake 180 with regard to free speech. At one point, free speech was considered to be sort of the core bedrock value of the left, until it no longer suited the left. And once the left acquired power, then it no longer favored free speech. Once upon a time, the left was opposed to, we'll call it the man, meaning corporate America, big business. But once the left got control of corporate America and big business, it was all in bed with big business. So it just proves that they are very much pupils of Lenin. And Lenin was a guy who would do anything, use anything to further his agenda, and that's what we're dealing with here.
Our guest is Eric Peters, everyone. It's ericpetersautos.com. Eric, really, thank you so much on a Friday night joining me like this. It's just a great way to cap the week for me. I'm so happy to hear your voice and to have you on the phone on the show like this. And you know, I opened the program, Eric, talking a little bit, sort of drawing out something that I tried to mention. I don't know if I really offered it in anything but a clunky way, but you know, I talked a little bit about this Silicon Valley Bank out in on the West Coast, and how the FDIC has taken it over. And very clearly, this has been something that's been in the works for at least a couple of weeks, because they've already established a new corporation that they didn't tell people about, and that will be handling the finances. So Gavin Newsom had to know about it. All of the so-called regulators had to have known about it. Regulators is just a word for mafia thugs, and telling people how they're going to do their business in a fascist way. But what really struck me is I mentioned how the presence of the federal government telling people, and I might even be phrasing it better now, but telling people this is the money you're going to use. It's going to come from, this bank that we're giving a monopoly. But whether it comes from the Federal Reserve or it comes from the Federal Treasury and they print up the money, it would be the same thing. You'd get the inflationary system going anyway, because they can't tax people enough. They have to print up money. They're just doing it indirectly through the Fed. But what gets me is that this creates moral hazards. This is the tragedy of the commons. Everybody argues with each other. So I translated this moral hazard from, it inspires people to be more risky. You'll get more risky loans. You get things that you get the boom bust cycle, and it doesn't allow for people to be able to be the husband their own resources. And I should have said that as I opened the show. And I translated that into, it's the same thing if you're trying to handle a viral outbreak. The more public areas you have, the more you're going to get people arguing about how it's going to be handled. And the less you're going to be able to see people husbanding and making their own decisions about their own safety. And if you had a real private paradigm with, say, viruses or banking or whatever, then the problems with contagion would be much easier to handle, whether it's a financial contagion or it's a viral pandemic, so-called, which the term is being misused as it has been often by government with the coronavirus. So do you feel that that's a sensible way to sort of make that translation, to say the presence of the government in both the financial sector and the so-called public health sector negates the ability of the individual not only to handle and husband his own or her own wealth or life, but also his or her own relationships in business or in private meetings with each other for money or for protection of his health?
Well, I think the contagion isn't a bug. I think it's a feature. Going back to what you were talking about with regard to this bank out in California, the people in the know, the insiders, the ones who can grift and game the system, who have the knowledge that doesn't filter out to the general public until afterward, have the ability to profit from all of this. And getting into the subject of the money, fundamentally, it's not the government; it's this private banking cartel that bought the government back in 1913 and acquired the legal monopoly on the currency, and was able at that point to manipulate the economy via increasing or decreasing the money supply, thereby devaluing the purchasing power of our money. And of course, you and I and the other proletariat don't have any clue about what's happening until after it's happened. And by that time, the people who were in the know on the inside have already cashed in and walked away. So I think that is fundamentally the moral hazard here.
And Eric, it's interesting because in the U.S. Constitution, we know that the Constitution grants the federal government the power to coin money, not the exclusive money, as Ron Paul has tried to point out, but the way they circumvent the Constitution is by, so let's say, for example, if we go back in history, you have Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris. Even prior to the actual Constitution, Robert Morris headed up a bank that helped facilitate the U.S. Revolution. He was pretty corrupt. He worked with Alexander Hamilton to try to get the Constitution put in with a taxing power, and they had a lot of friends. Hamilton wanted a central bank. They got the central bank going, and sure enough, that did the same sort of thing. And they were putting out money left and right, inflationary. The only person who stopped it was Andrew Jackson. But even there, when they had state banks in the so-called free banking era of the United States, the state banks, the banks that were on the state level, in order to start a bank inside a state, even when they eliminated and was supposedly a free banking era, those banks could only open if they accepted and they bought up a certain amount of state debt. And then 14 states ended up defaulting on their debts back in that so-called free banking era. So critics of the so-called free banking era claim that it didn't work, but it wasn't a really free banking era. If we had freedom, people could separate from this corrupt system, from these, from these, you might say, financial pandemics.
Sure. I'm a big proponent of money, real money, meaning gold and silver, because it's much, much more difficult to manipulate the value of gold and silver, far more difficult and almost impossible to inflate the quantity of it that's in circulation and thereby devalue it. And it's something that's physical and tangible and directly under our control. You know, if you've got a gold coin in your pocket, it can't be disappeared via an app on your phone, as these central bank digital currencies that they're talking about would facilitate. You know, and I find that, by the way, to be the greatest single dagger aimed at the heart of what's left of our liberties. And if that should come to pass, I think it's almost a game over situation for us.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, we saw Saule Amarova, who studied in Moscow, got her degree in Moscow, avowed communist. They tried to bring her as the head of the comptroller, and that didn't work out. But they're going to do the policies as much as they can. We've got Yellen, who's been pushing for CBDC. We've got Elizabeth Warren, who's been pushing for CBDC. Of course, they used the FTX thing. I think that was part of a larger plan that they had to try to broad brush crypto and things like that. You know, I prefer hard currency because you don't need electricity for it. And
yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And part of the electric problem is you've been touching on this a lot. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit about some of the items that you've got over at Eric Peters Autos, Eric, because these are very, very timely. You've always been timely, talking about electric vehicles and the dangers and the absolute unworkability of that. I've gotten to write some articles recently about how there aren't enough minerals that they think are available on the whole earth to be able to run all of the solar that they want. So it seems to me that their plans, as pie in the sky as they are, and as clearly unworkable as they are, they want everybody to go electric, and they want to control that grid. And the corporations that are very close and have been bailed out in the past, GM and others, they're buying into this. And you have written numerous items on this, and I'd love for you to offer to people. Could you tell us very briefly? I know that you had been mentioning in the past that Toyota had been very, very good as far as electric vehicles went, and that they were sticking with it. But now, I guess the original founder of Toyota is no longer in the picture. Is there anyone else who's is it Mazda is one of the few that's still holding on, or can you mention any of that? And I know it's not exactly pertinent to some of your recent pieces, but I'm curious.
No, it's very pertinent because we all know about the ESG thing and the way ESG has been used to turn corporations toward this leftist collectivist agenda.
Yeah.
And that's what happened, I think, over at Toyota. It was Akio Toyota, who is the grandson of the founder of the company.
Okay.
And, he was, if we to use the word hesitant, let's say, about EVs. Very much a car guy, very much a guy who's interested in selling cars, not collecting subsidies and virtue signaling. Anyway, he was very abruptly moved out of his position, and a younger guy was put in his place. And at the same time, they issued a press release talking about how Toyota is going to recommit itself to this electrification agenda. So you can see the politics behind it. And then lo and behold, not even a month later, the same thing happened at Subaru. Subaru is the one of very few manufacturers that does not sell a single EV yet. And sure enough, they got rid of the guy who was in charge at Subaru and put in a new guy, and, drum roll please, at the very same time announced that they would accelerate their transition to this all-electric future, notwithstanding that there is virtually no market demand for this. You look at the number of EVs; it's wildly, the perception that they're everywhere is wildly overstated. Tesla has 2% of the market, and to give you some other context and perspective, one of the best-selling Subarus is the Crosstrek, which is a small crossover. In the first 2 months of this year, they sold about 27,000 of these things. And to really drive the point home, in all of last year, Ford, a much bigger car company, sold only about 15,000 of its electric Lightning pickup trucks.
Wow.
So, you tell me, if the market worked, the market would be seeing fewer rather than more electric cars. But all of this is being driven by this virtue signaling, ESG-ing, and this rent seeking. And people ask me, well, why are they doing this? And the reason is, the people that are in charge at these big car companies, for example, Mary Barra at General Motors, she gets paid $20 million a year. What does she care? From her point, she's feathering her nest by going along with this. It doesn't matter. I know people in the middle levels at the car companies, and they're terrified of what the future holds for them and for the car companies, but they are not the ones in the positions to make the decisions.
What levels did you say that was, Eric?
Middle middle level management people,
Sure.
marketing people, and engineers.
Yeah, yeah. And you reminded me, I think you and I discussed this. I think I got to talk to you about this, Eric. I was looking into Australia and how so they were promoting the idea that the Tesla was the number one selling sedan in Australia. And then you look it up and you find out that they're subsidizing the purchase of the Tesla sedan.
Of course. Yeah, and it's even worse. I think it's in Norway. The subsidy is staggering. It's something like, I think, $22,000 or $23,000 per purchase, per individual. And so, yeah, they've got a high uptake of these EVs. But I think the market, if there ever was any, has already reached saturation because of the cost of these things.
Yeah.
The average EV, typically, like the Tesla Model 3, for example, it's a $45,000 car. And by the way, that's with the weak battery. They never tell you this, but these EVs typically come standard with a weak battery that won't take you very far. So in order to make it a functionally viable vehicle, you need to pay extra for the optional battery.
Yeah.
And in the case of a model like the Tesla 3, it's about $10,000 more to get that battery. So now you're well over $50,000 for a car that's basically a compact sedan that's comparable to a Honda Civic sedan. And that's good for maybe commuting purposes, but it's not usable as a family car. And how many people can afford to spend $50,000-$60,000 on a car, any car, whether it's electric or otherwise?
Unbelievable. It's absolutely crazy. It reminds me of this push to try to knock out the gas stoves. And I don't know what people are going to do when they have mobile homes and they have to operate by propane and things like that. They want to eliminate all these things. And it just makes no sense whatsoever. But the people at the tops of these corporations, it seems like they're banking on being the ones who will be able to get the bailouts and be able to get the government contracts and be able to get the Federal Reserve money, which, as I mentioned, under the CARES Act, and you're probably aware of this as numerous people are, Eric, under the CARES Act, the Federal Reserve can now buy the bonds of any corporations that they want to buy, and they don't even have to report the financial basics of that corporation. They don't have to say anything. I mean, talk about fascism. I mean, that's just incredible. It's amazing. And so I think these people are banking on the idea that if their corporations are in trouble or if they want to do any special projects, they don't have to count on the consumer anymore. They don't have to please the consumer. They just have to please the fascist central government, central banking cartel.
That's a facet of it, and I think it speaks to the dictum of Lenin, going back to that, about how the capitalists will sell us the rope that we use to hang them with, and I think there's a great deal of truth in that.
Yeah.
The higher up you go, though, you begin to understand that these people know perfectly well what they're doing. This isn't about mere stupidity. Oh, how is it going to work? It's not going to work. There's not enough electrical generating capacity to do all this. There's not enough minerals, and there's not enough this, and there's not enough that. They know that. The point is to impoverish us, period.
Yeah.
The point is to make us dependent, period. The point is to centralize all energy into one centralized form, electricity, that they have absolute control over and can turn off and on at their whim in order to control us. So that's what this is all about.
And I don't think we would be seeing this now, the manifestation of what has been a long-term, multi-decade plan from these so-called urban planners to give us the 15-minute city where they're going to be drawing out their public transportation routes on their rail lines and so on, which, of course, they will control, and eliminating our ability to get cars. Car makers are now, what do they call them? They're not travel facilitators, but they're
mobility providers.
Mobility providers. There you go. Mobility providers. What's that?
Isn't that great? And by the way, speaking of these 15-minute cities, were you at all? Did your antennae perk when Trump started talking about his freedom cities?
Yes, absolutely. That was I couldn't believe that. And in fact, what I ended up doing was I went to the 10th Amendment Center, and I talked about how it's totally Agenda 2030. I mean, it's Agenda 21. It's all of it together, and it blows my mind because we already there are videos that have been out for 10 years about China's ghost cities. It's the exact same mentality. They've built malls where nobody goes. They have apartment complexes that they've built in China. Nobody goes. They've taken over little huts from people and put in these giant complexes. They're bringing them down now. The whole system has collapsed. And of course, it's all central planning. And it's all based on that same philosophy. And that's Donald Trump, their savior, the supposed conservative. Amazing.
I got about 11 minutes into the speech that he gave at CPAC when I arrived at the point where he started talking about how he's going to save, quote, our great social security system.
Yes.
That's that.
Yes, and you have a piece on that, Eric. Why don't you tell people about that? Because I did the same thing and in fact I played the quote and I said, and he was being applauded. He was being applauded at CPAC. Why don't we go over to that, because you've got that the measure of how left the right has become. I'm flashing it up on the screen right now for people.
Yeah, is there anything more profoundly not indicative? So what's the word I'm looking for? That conveys what leftism is all about than that program, Social Security.
Yes,
it is the bedrock of the social welfare state created by the left in the 30s. And here we have a guy who's supposedly a right winger defending it. And I got a taste of this many years ago. You remember the Tea Party movement?
Yeah.
I went to one of those things and figuring I'm going to find some like-minded people here. And when I started talking about how much of an outrage it was that people are compelled, forced, and threatened with violence if they do not, quote unquote, contribute to Social Security, and I thought that was an outrageous thing, they drew themselves up in great indignation that I would dare to suggest that Social Security be abolished and that people be left alone and free to invest their own money in their own retirement. And so this cancer has metastasized and spread even into the corners of what putatively is the opposition to the left.
Absolutely, Eric. We're speaking with Eric Peters. You bring up the moral point, Eric, and that's all that's really needed. The idea that a conservative would breach that morally is amazing. Of course, oh yeah, absolutely, Eric. And I tried to give some people an out to say, well, they feel as if they've already paid into the system, they've already been enslaved by the system, and they want to get back from it what they paid in. But they have to admit that the only way they can get that money back from this pyramid Ponzi scheme, in which the first woman who ever drew anything from it got more than what she put into it. So everybody knew from the start that it was a Ponzi scheme and that it was a way to gain some sort of support from the people who are going to get on the government teat. The only way that these people who now feel resentment that they might not get the money that was taken from them is it's going to be taken from somebody else. It's going to be generational enslavement. That's what we have.
I've got great sympathy for people who've been defrauded because I'm one of them.
Yeah.
I'd like to have back the 15% of every dollar that's been taken from me since I began working when I was 16.
Yeah.
But the fact that injustice has been perpetrated on me and on anybody else doesn't give me the moral right to perpetrate injustice on someone else. I think a good way to understand it and to look at it is, let's say, you're out for a night on the town and you get mugged. A thug comes out of an alley and he steals your wallet and he takes your watch. Well, does that give you the right to then wait in the alley for the next person to come along to take his wallet and his watch to make up for what you just lost?
That's perfectly stated. And no matter how many rationales and arguments people can make and repeat the same thing over and over again, I want what is owed me and so on, and they cannot get around that moral barrier. They can't get over it. They can't get under it. They can't get around it because it is the reality of it, Eric. And I wish if we had been in the same building and you were, let's say we lived in an apartment complex, you would have heard me crying out and I would have heard you crying out like, Trump.
Now, as a purely practical matter, I understand that some people now are at a point where they are perhaps too old or too infirm and they need this money. And I would be willing to countenance some sort of solution wherein the people who are in that category continue to receive benefits. But having said that, I would like to see young people in particular free to no longer have to participate in this odious system.
Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great? Yeah, and Eric, our guest is Eric Peters. Please go to ericpetersautos.com, everybody, and follow him on Twitter at Libertarian Car G, the letter G, on Twitter, at Libertarian Car G. Eric, you're just talk about electric power. I really enjoy talking to you because you get me all charged up, and it's a real positive too, because it's sort of like, I used to drive to the Foundation for Economic Education over in Irvington, New York, from New Hampshire. It was like a 5.5 hour drive. Each month I'd go down because they had their speakers series there. And I got to see some great people, Robert Higgs, Richard Ebeling, a lot of really good folks, you know. And it got me so excited, so charged up. And the first article I ever got published was published by Foundation for Economic Education in the Freemen. So there was that tie to Albert J. Nock and some of those, you know, earlier libertarian folks that I really liked, and Henry Hazlitt and those guys, you know. And so talking to you, it's that sort of same thing. Like if my dad were here, he'd be like, "Oh, I like this guy. He's great." And the thing that gets me sometimes is, you know, when we look at the way that, you know, something like Social Security is imposed on people, the way that Medicare and Medicaid are imposed on people, we can look at historical examples. And just over the past couple of weeks, Eric, I brought up the classic essay "Not Yours to Give" by Davy Crockett. Where he, you know, in 1830, he said, yeah, you know, I made a mistake. I thought I could use the other people's money to help person A or B over here. And then I met a guy back in Tennessee who, you know, he opened my eyes and I realized that's right. It's not constitutionally sanctioned. And then he offered on the House floor, they were trying to get money for the widow of a naval veteran. And he said, look, we don't have the constitutional power to do it. We don't have the moral authority to take people's money for this. It's not charity to do this, but I'll volunteer a week's salary. And they raised the money. And it's the same thing. Then I turned to James Madison. And of course, both of these came from the 10th Amendment Center. I think Mike Meharry wrote one, and I can't remember who wrote the other one. But it was, you know, talking about the last thing that James Madison did. And here you have a guy who was more of a centralizer than Thomas Jefferson. But before Madison left office, the last thing he did was veto a so-called, at that time, internal improvements pork bill for canals and roads. And he said, look, as much as I like these ideas personally, I swore an oath to the Constitution. And it's amazing to see how much, as you wrote in your piece, folks, it's called A Measure of How Left the Right Has Become. Came out 2 days ago. Eric, you're very prolific, but you hit it spot on here. Do you have any other thoughts where you want to bring this up about what you'd love to remind conservatives about the CPAC speech?
With regard to this stuff, you know, once you admit that principle, how do you stop it? Where does it end? You know, if the government has the rightful moral authority to compel you to provide for somebody else's retirement, let's say, by taking 15% of everything you earn, why would it not also follow that the government has the right to do the same to provide other people with housing, let's say, or food, you name it? Where does it end? And how would you end it? How would you object to it? On what basis? And the answer, of course, is you can't. So it all becomes this situational thing where, you know, essentially the voice that screeches the loudest and has the most political support ends up being the one that has the say, not the moral principle. Hey, that's not your money. You don't have the right to take it from this person and just give it to that person.
Right. Absolutely. And then, of course, you have, and they don't really need to be considerations, but if one is going to take it in this consequentialist, immoral, ends justify the means way, and of course, consequentialism or utilitarianism is self-indicting, because as we often hear, the greatest good for the greatest number philosophy is a negation of the individual, and of course that means that every individual can be a potential victim, just as the very concept of the erroneous concept of public health goes. They can sacrifice the health of the one for the greater health of everybody, but that means that every single person who comprises the everybody is a potential victim, which then causes a tautology. And
well, it begs a question too, doesn't it? According to whom? The greatest good according to whom?
Yes, I said the very same words, either like Monday or Friday, Eric. That's exactly it. You have to ask Jeremy Bentham and David Hume, who defines good? What is, you're not allowing, because good is defined subjectively, as the Austrian economist told us, and we know. And it's amazing because all of this is biblically told. It's explained to us in the Ten Commandments. The Golden Rule explains it. And it seems as if people don't explore it. And the thing that gets me is, even if we went by their utilitarian standards, which aren't standards, they pretend they're standards. Even if we were to do that, then it destroys the incentives of people to work and become wealthy. So then you're killing the calf right there.
Well, it also destroys something else that I think is more profoundly important, and that is our feeling and attitude towards one another. when somebody else has the power to stick a bayonet in your back and tell you what you're going to do and what you're going to pay and how much you're going to give them, you begin to hate. You begin to regard your fellow man with contempt as a threat.
Yeah.
You know, when we deal with one another on a voluntary basis, we come to agreements, we're peaceful. Hey, you know, I've got something here you might be interested in. Would you like to buy it?
Right.
That's interesting. It looks good to me. Sure, I'll buy it. And then let's talk about how much and so on. You know, there's no anger and recrimination in an exchange like that.
Yeah.
But when you look at something like, look at Social Security, what it does is it pits one generation against the next. You know, you've got the young talking about the greedy geezers, and then you've got the older people who are on Social Security talking about the selfish young, and they're at each other's throats. And meanwhile, the young are impoverished, and then the older are impoverished, and so they both become dependent on government, which profits from the exchange.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Boy, that's perfectly stated, Eric. You know, and isn't it interesting too? You remember that classic line on John Stossel speaking up in favor of free markets. He says it's an amazing thing with markets, with exchange, which ought to tell people right there, it's an exchange. It's not predation. It's not exploitation. It's a trade. But he says you get this moment of mutual thank you, where both sides who are party to the exchange say thank you because they both benefited. Otherwise, they wouldn't have participated in the exchange.
Yep, and that's why the left has to sort of tip its hat to the market in a way by calling things like the person you're forced to deal with at the DMV or having the DMV call you a customer.
Yes,
you know, they invert everything.
Yes.
But it's interesting because by doing so, they admit, in a way, tongue in cheek, that the market is right and they're wrong.
Yes, boy, that's a great insight. You know, Eric, a while back I tried to mention to people how the FCC, patently unconstitutional and ridiculous and absurd, they still have this sort of vestigial reference to what actually is in the Constitution. You know, the First Amendment, as you know, only stipulates that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And there were lots of speech codes, and as much as I wouldn't like them to be, they had differentiation in states. They had religious schools that were sponsored by the states and so on. And what's interesting is even with the FCC now, the FCC will impose fines on, let's say, CBS putting Janet Jackson's exposure of her chest on the Super Bowl. And they'll say that went against what they call community standards. And it's their community standards that actually are no longer decided by the community. They're decided by the FCC, but they still call them. And that's great that it's like the Internal Revenue Service, or as you say, going to the DMZ and next customer. And it does actually still give the lie to the fact that they're still trying to appeal to people by making it look like it's voluntary.
There's something else that relates to this that I've often thought to be interesting. You know, collectivism talks about the group, you know, the people.
Yeah.
But when you dig into it, it's nonsense, because what you've got is a kind of deformed and perverted form of the worst kind of caricature of individualism and selfishness that the left uses to paint us. Because in any collective, there are always a handful of individuals that run and dictate everything to the collective.
Yes, you had that in one of your pieces. Which one was that? That was excellent, Eric.
I can't remember. It was probably one of the last 2 or 3 I wrote.
Yeah. Please repeat that, because I'm so glad you brought that up, because I did a little like blue highlight on that when I was reading. I was like, oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. Please repeat that. The people who call themselves collectivists and they believe that they're part of the collective that's making the decision, they're actually the collective. It's always individual volition.
Yes, well, what it is a handful of individuals control the collective, but it's ingenious because they'll talk about the people, public, this, you know, and democracy. But in fact, the operational control of the collective is in the hands of a few individuals. So you've got this almost cartoonish, exaggerated version of the way they portray us individualists, us selfish people, us capitalists, us libertarian-minded people, where they're the ones who are saying that what they want as individuals, their attitudes about the way things should be, what do the people need? We're going to give it to them, and we're going to tell them what they need, and we're going to make sure they pay for it.
That's a great point. And, you know, it goes to, you probably have seen the interview where somebody went up to Bernie Sanders and sat down with him. And I think Bernie Sanders was not ready for it in any way whatsoever. And he said, so it's wrong for me to take something from you, and that's stealing. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yes, yes, absolutely. That's immoral. Yes. How does increasing the number of people who do it make it any more moral? Ed Birdie's like, I don't know what I don't know what you're driving at here. I don't understand what you're driving at. And he doesn't have to drive any farther. He's at the point. He's already asked the question, and Bernie couldn't answer it. And I thought that's excellent because and at the heart of it again, you bring up people like Lenin and so on, and they use that excuse of, oh, we represent the collective, we are part of the collective. And of course, they're doing it to aggrandize their own power, which is one of the reasons why the collectivists in Washington use the term democracy all the time, because it's a cipher for collectivism.
Sure, it's absolutely ingenious. It diverts the attention of the people away from, as in the past when you had a monarch, let's say, or even a dictator, a single man, who said that I am the one and I control everything. And of course, indeed, they did. But when the people control everything, what could be better? The people control everything.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Eric, I'm going to be searching. I've pulled the screen down for just a minute because there was a great piece from Hans Hermann Hoppe that someone posted, and I reposted it over at Twitter. And I thought it was terrific. And of course, Hoppe's just been great. He wrote the book "Democracy: The God That Failed." He's a terrific political philosopher, anarchist / monarchist, actually, who says, if you're going to have some sort of government, you probably would prefer to have it be a monarchy. But tell us a little bit about. I'd love to get your thoughts about the one of your recent stories about the roads, the speed limit stories, because that one has a lot to it, of course, but it's also something that I think people can start to see how private systems don't operate the same way that the government systems do, and they don't erode people's rights the way the government systems do.
Well, there are a lot of facets to it. Where do we start? They will, for example, put speed limits up, arbitrary velocity maximums that if you exceed constitute an offense or a crime, and that they can go after you and threaten you with murderous violence and then hand you a piece of paper that tells you that you owe them money for this thing.
Right.
But the irony of it is that the enforcers of the speed limit, which we're told has to be enforced because it's a matter of public safety, because to drive any faster than whatever the sign says you may is unsafe. Well, you find the cop wheeling around and racking his cruiser up to probably a whole lot faster than you were going in order to catch you and give you that extortion note. Now, riddle me this, Batman. How does that work? I mean, if it's not safe for me to drive, let's say, 70 on a road with a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and I pass a radar trap, there's a cop lurking in the bushes, and he turns around and he whips out after me, but I'm already down the road a piece, and so he gets up to 90, 100 miles an hour to catch up to me. I mean, does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. You have on your page, on the article, which is entitled "The Irony of Safety," released yesterday. I was cracking up. You've got a great picture from Police to Police, and they're awesome. And it has a picture of a trooper who's pulled up some person in a I don't know, maybe it's O.J. Simpson in a white Ford Explorer or Bronco or something. It says, "My job," says the police officer, "is to keep people safe. So if you drive faster than we say you can, we will claim you owe us money. In order to get this money from you, I will travel much faster than you, blaring a siren, flashing lights, weaving in and out of traffic, and if necessary, crash my car into yours and fire weapons in public. That is how we keep you safe."
Isn't it great?
That's classic.
Now, but to get to the bedrock issue here, I think from a libertarian moral point of view, we're really talking about punishing people or harming them who have not caused any harm on this premise that, well, they might. That's the argument.
Yes, that
if you drive 70 in a 55, let's say, you might hurt somebody. So because you might hurt somebody in the subjective opinion of whoever, that becomes the pretext for actually hurting somebody.
Right, absolutely. And we often say this, when you get these tickets for parking or for speeding or anything like that, if you were to ask the judge, whom have I hurt? Why am I being punished for not harming anyone? And this goes all the way back to, I often mention on the show, tort common laws, tortious laws, common law torts, and the idea that if you were going to be going to court and you were going to bring a tortious claim against someone, it had to be a person. The state is not a person. The state is an entity. It's a corporation, and it's not a person. So the state can't claim damages. And of course, you haven't harmed anybody by driving very, very quickly. And if that's the case, then you can use the same argument against the cop.
Of course. And there's also an element of reductio ad absurdum here. Whenever I discuss this with somebody, they'll invariably bring up the hysterical example of, well, if we didn't have speed limit laws, people would drive 100 miles an hour through school zones. And that's one of the things that they'll say. And that may well be true. There are always going to be reckless and homicidal people. There might be. By and large, though, most people won't do that because most people are not reckless and homicidal people. But what you get when you enshrine that principle in the law, that it's okay to ticket people for this, well, it just kind of keeps getting more and more and more ridiculous to the point where there are all these penny ante offenses that clearly entail no harm to anybody else or even really the possibility of it. Now, for example, they can now pull you over. An armed man in a funny uniform can pull you over and threaten you with murderous violence because you haven't worn your seatbelt.
Amazing. Amazing. And as a personal story, Eric, I'll tell you, one of the times I went down to visit Foundation for Economic Education, I stayed over in Irvington, New York. And of course, in New Hampshire, we have no safety belt laws. And we can get into the airbag thing in just a minute as well, Eric. I'd love to get your thoughts on that if you can stay for another 5 minutes.
Sure.
Oh, great. Eric Peters is our guest, everybody. It's ericpetersautos.com. And I'm going to go into the Rokfin chat, lay down some questions. If you have any comments or anything, anybody, please do so in Rokfin chat. I can't see the Rumble chat right now, but we're also streaming on Rumble, everybody, and on my Twitter feed. But, yeah, Eric, I got pulled over because I was pulling out of the Foundation for Economic Education parking lot, and I had not put my seatbelt on yet. There was a particular stoplight just north of there. There was a Shell station in the corner, and that was usually around the point where I would put my seatbelt on. And I hadn't put it on. There was a cop in the parking lot, pulled me over. It was like 96 degrees that day, kept me sitting there for a half hour. And of course, he pulled me over because I had out-of-state plates, and he knew they'd be able to get money. So he pulls me over. He goes, you don't have a seatbelt on. I was like, oh, yeah, I hadn't put it on yet. He goes, yeah, well, So he gives me a ticket. Now, here's one of the glorious things of the way their system works, especially for out-of-state people. He writes down something on there. I said, so he gives it back to me after all this time. And my license, he gives me the ticket. And I said, what's the cost here? He goes, I don't know how much it'll cost. I was like, you don't know how much a ticket for not having a safety belt costs? Mm-hmm. I found that highly dubious. And I was like, so how am I supposed to know how much this is? He goes, oh, I wrote the phone number on the back, so you call the number. I was like, okay, but you do understand, I would love to know now because I could. So I call the number, right? I get north, it was like a Friday or something like that, or a Saturday. So I get north, I call the number on Monday, and they said, oh, well, we can't tell you how much the ticket is either. I call the court, the number that he gave me. It's the court. I was like, what do you mean you can't tell me? And they said, oh, no, you have to go to the court, and then they'll determine what the fine is. So I said, well, I'm out of state. And they said, yeah. And I was like, well, you do understand, I have to make a calculation here. Do I pay the fine, or do I spend the money on the gasoline and the time to take off to fight this in court? I was like, I think you're expecting that I'm going to pay whatever you want me to pay. That's what you want. And they said, well, I said, what can I do about this? And they said, well, you can send a letter. At that time, it had to be like a letter or a fax. You can send a letter to the judge and explain. So I did, and I explained to the judge that I hadn't harmed anybody, that there was no injured person, and that seatbelt laws were just a way to make money. And he actually agreed.
Astounding.
Yeah, he wrote back, and he waived the fine. I had to pay the court costs, of course, because even though I won, the real winner was the government.
Every once in a while you do win one, though. I had an encounter like that years and years ago when I still lived in the Northern Virginia area. I went to Skyline Drive, which is part of the Blue Ridge Parkway in that neck of Virginia. And they have these little kiosks at the entrances that you have to drive through. And sometimes you have to pay a couple bucks to be able to get out there. And, so I pulled up and I handed the guy the money. And he said to me, buckle up. And of course I ignored him and just kept going about my way after I paid. And he actually got in his car and came after me, pulled me over. And we got into a discussion, which you could still do in those days because they weren't all steroid-addled hut types. And he started talking to me about my seatbelt, and I had the temerity to observe his beer belly.
Yeah.
And I said, how about you hit the gym and maybe stop eating so much, because that would be very good for your health. And it's the same thing. You're telling me I have to wear a seatbelt because it keeps me safe. It's good for me.
Right.
Like you're my parent, and I'm an idiot child. And you're wrapping my my fingers with your ruler.
Yeah.
And he said, you know what, you got a point. And we talked for a little bit more, and he just let me go on my way. But that's a rare thing to happen these days.
Oh, of course. And of course, the more they centralize the healthcare system like they've done with the NHS, the more average Americans will feel that they're justified to tell people how they can operate their peaceful, consensual behavior, or just their individual behavior, their eating habits, their exercise habits, whether they wear seatbelts. Because, of course, then it's the argument of, well, we all pay for your mistakes.
Exactly. It
Amazing.
becomes a matter of quote unquote public concern.
Yeah,
and so you no longer have any private right to, as a free human being, to make decisions for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. Let's go into, if you get the opportunity, Eric, and I know we're sort of going over time. I really appreciate you hanging out, Eric. This is great. Let's talk about the airbag issue. Yeah. And the airbags, as I mentioned to you in text, I run into a lot of students, and I'll as I start to go into the regulatory schemas and these gangland threats that they make against companies, and how fascist and the growing fascism, and the difference between that and experimentation, the claim of ownership of roads, and how they can then dictate what the cars will be like that go on the roads, and the regulations for the manufacturers that the federal government puts in. All these things combine to reduce our ability to be able to make decisions for ourselves, which in the case of airbags saw a lot of little kids killed, in part thanks to Elizabeth Dole and her desires on airbags. Tell us a little bit about the airbag story.
Well, yeah, it gets to the issue of free exchange that we were talking about earlier. It was the case once upon a time that car companies would develop a feature, and they would see whether there was a market for it. They would make it available, and hey, let's see if people like this. And the liking would be measured by their willingness to buy it. So a lot of people don't know that airbags were once offered voluntarily on the free exchange basis by General Motors and Ford and Chrysler. And you could buy an airbag if you wanted an airbag. It was available. Not enough people bought them to make it worth continuing to put them in cars. And so they stopped making them and putting them in cars. And this outraged the collectivists, the safety Nazis, people like Joan Claybrook and then later Bob Dole's wife, who decided that their opinion, their belief that we, royal, all of us, we need airbags, even though clearly most of us don't want them. Nonetheless, they passed federal regulatory fatwas requiring the car companies to put them in cars, period. And if you wanted a new car, you have to pay for it, period.
Yes.
Including paying for the potential risk. I'm not saying that airbags don't save lives, but the fact is they also take them. And that decision has been taken away from you to weigh the pros and the cons of the airbags. And perhaps the most vicious thing about it is that the automakers decided, they did a big 180 on this. Instead of looking at it and saying, our customers don't want this, they realized, you know what? When the government can force everybody to buy them, we can make more money selling them. And that's exactly what's happened. And now we have this complete inversion of capitalism. It's a caricature of capitalism. It's corporate cronyism. It's rent seeking. It's grifting, where these big companies work hand in hand with the government to foist things onto people and compel them to buy them. Well, compelling in the sense that if you want whatever it is, like a car, you really don't have any choice unless you buy a much older car that doesn't have these features.
Exactly. And it blows me away because you think about how the government doing this essentially made it such that, I talked a little bit, Eric, about how the Mises Institute guys were discussing the rail system. and how the so-called safety parameters that the government institutes through the rail regulations, or whether it might be OSHA in businesses, or it might be something else, the National Transportation Safety Administration, they create these minimum standards. And for the large corporations, that they actually will lobby to keep those standards very low. Where if you had a private paradigm, it might be that you'd have a much safer paradigm. Who knows? On the roads, you might have a safer paradigm. We would have more choices. We would have Autobahn-style roads where people could go very, very quickly because they have great skills. And we would have other roads where bad drivers are. Right now, they make it the tragedy of the commons, where we, the good drivers, are stuck around old grannies going 20 miles an hour in a 50,
Here's a really good example that speaks to your point. Before the government got into the business of mandating safety and minimum standards of safety, there was a company that focused on building extremely safe cars as its number one priority. We know the name of that company, don't we? Volvo. Remember the tank-like big boxy Volvos of the 70s?
Yep.
And people bought those specifically because that's what they wanted and needed. And so they bought that car. And those cars were known to be incredibly tough and durable. And that was a free market solution. But at the same time, if you were willing to drive something that perhaps wasn't as tank-like, and you wanted a car that was lighter, got better gas mileage, let's say, you were free to make that choice. What's happened now is we have no choice, because these arrogant people have decided that they know best, and they're going to force us to do what they say they think is best.
Oh, it's amazing, And Eric, you also make me think about, and going back to your speed limit piece, this idea that they've got to protect people who aren't even on the roads with you. They'll pull you over. Let's say somebody were to make the argument, well, they should definitely be policing it when there are other people on the roads. Again, we get to a point where we don't know what really is the optimal speed and the optimal number of cars on a road, because it's all government run. And we'll bring you back to that example that Reason Magazine put out, where they had people go out onto the highways in California outside LA, and they all drove the speed limit side by side in every lane. And it caused absolute mayhem because there was a massive backup behind them, because the natural flow was supposed to be faster than that. People could drive at faster rates. It actually made it less safe because people were trying to get around them. They were getting so frustrated. So the government is clearly not reflecting what is optimally safe either. Even if one were to trust that the government had some moral authority to run the roads, they don't make the practical decisions the way the free market could make the decisions.
Well, it gets us back to this whole business of whether something is just or unjust. When you are given a piece of paper that says you owe money because you violated the statute, you are annoyed. You feel put upon. You feel as though an injustice has been done to you because what? You haven't hurt anybody. You have to go to court because you didn't come to a complete stop at a stop sign at 3 o'clock in the morning when there was no other car around for 5 miles. And now you have to hand over $200 because there was some cop waiting there, just waiting for somebody to not come to a complete stop. You feel rightly, understandably aggrieved that you have been unjustly treated. On the other hand, let's say you're inattentive, you blew through a red light because you weren't paying attention, and you hit somebody else and you damaged their car, maybe you hurt them. If you're not a sociopath, you are going to feel, yeah, God, I really did an awful thing. I need to do what's necessary to make them whole, to pay the costs that I've incurred on those people.
Yeah.
You would never feel like, when you go to court and the judge orders you to pay and do this and do that, you're not going to be angry about it because you screwed up. You hurt somebody. And again, unless you're a sociopath, you're going to accept that with equanimity.
Boy, absolutely right, Eric. That's I wish I could get you in front of my class, because this is the sort of thing, especially the teenagers, they're much more willing, I think, to speak up, that I've noticed, than adults. And I don't know if it's because the adults, they feel resentful that you're shaking the boat and you're doing, I don't know what it is, but it's very strange. But I'll get kids, and when I do mention things like, like the airbags, I'll say, I'll open it up, hey, you guys remember riding in the back of the car? And they'll say, sure. And I was like, do you know why you ride in the back of the car? I was like, no, it's because government impositions of airbags led to kids getting their spines, their necks sometimes decapitated when the airbags went off if the kids were in the front seat. So as a response to government already making a massive moral leap to tell people what should be in their cars, which caused these terrible tragedies for parents and the losses of so many little kids' lives, they imposed a new imposition. So they put a Band-Aid on the cut that they already created. And
Sure.
yeah, and it's and so then the kids get it. And unfortunately, I think, so many people are raised in environments where, oh, the central bank already exists. Oh, FDIC already exists. Those are the rules under which they operate, not realizing that the rules themselves are immoral and that there's another way. As Theodoric of York might have said, perhaps there's a different way.
Yeah, well, one of the great things about young people, kids in particular, is that they tend to ask why.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it's a sad thing that as we get older, a lot of us tend to lose that reflex.
Yeah.
When we're presented with something, okay, well, why should I do that? Explain it to me. Give me a good reason.
Perfect,
and if a good reason isn't forthcoming, if the only reason is because I said so, I mean, you can figure out that somebody's basically trying to bully you. They haven't got your best interests at heart. They are trying to bully you, and nobody likes a bully. And yet they couch all of this bullying in this oleaginous, soft-sounding terminology. For example, the government will say, or politicians will say, "We ask you to contribute your fair share."
Oh.
No, they're telling you how much they're going to take from you.
And they're defining what is fair.
Right.
Exactly. That's perfectly stated. Eric, I know this has just been awesome, and I love having you on here. This is so great. As I said, for my Friday, it's perfect. It's so fantastic. And there's so many other issues that I want to discuss, whether it's Kamala Harris claiming that she's running into children who are having climate change psychological problems, or it's Biden claiming that there's more energy available now and they've reduced energy prices. There's so much stuff. So much. But I'll glue myself like a protester at Volkswagen. I'll glue myself to the schedule here.
Okay.
And
that sounds good. We could do it another time.
Yeah, I'd love it, Eric. I'd love it. And I know the audience, people just, I can't speak for everybody, but I see great things. I don't want to be so assumptive as to define how somebody else values their time or whatever, but I know a lot of people say great things about everything that you do. So I really appreciate what you do, man.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. And as I said, let's do it again soon.
Oh, that sounds awesome. It's Eric Peters Autos. Go there, or B Square. And it's awesome. And now, Eric, by the way, I know you have your Rumble channel. Let's mention that before you go. What's the name of the Rumble channel?
Oh my gosh, I'm embarrassed to admit that I don't know for sure. I'm not sure what the actual channel is, but if you could click on any of the videos that I often insert with my articles on the main site, on EP Autos, you'll be able to find it easily enough.
All right, and if they go to the Irony of Safety one, they'll see it. It's just scroll down just a little bit. It's right there. Awesome. Thanks, Eric. This is great, man.
You bet, Bart. Okay, talk soon.
You got it. Have a great weekend, and watch out for the seatbelt maniacs. Okay, bye. Thanks, Bye. Eric. Thank you so much. Bye. Oh, that was awesome. He's a great guy. Hey, everybody, I know we're going to be running up against the clock here. So what I'll do is tomorrow I'll go live, and there's actual police footage of this high-speed chase that helped inspire his article, by the way, over at Eric Peters Autos. And down here you will see Eric's. I like that. Step in a crack, break your mother's back. Whoops, sorry about that. There's that. That's cute. There's Eric's video right there as he explains what inspired him as he drives along. And he's in a new vehicle. He's doing a road test on that vehicle. So check it out. It's all, of course, at Eric Peters Autos. And it's really, really good stuff. But since we've got so much more to cover tonight, before I do anything else, I want to talk to the Rokfiners and to the Rockers and Rokfin, man. And get ready to give you the Fight for 15 story tonight. And I hope you like this one. So Little John is there. Little John, thank you. He says, thank you, Eric. And thanks for posting the link to epautos.com. Yeah, EP Autos or Eric Peters Autos. Either one works. That's totally good. And by the way, someone just subscribed to my Substack. and did a lifetime subscription. And that I'm not going to mention who it was. I'll email that person, but it's a person who is part of the chat here. That was really, really cool. You're going to get something very special for that. I'll email you and try to get your address because I want to thank you for that. That was really, really nice of you.